Picture the sprawling Texas frontier of 1878, where the crimson sunset bleeds across endless prairies and the whisper of ancient winds carries secrets older than memory itself. Imagine a world where bloodlines determine destiny, where the color of one's skin can seal their fate before they speak a single word. In this unforgiving landscape of mesquite and limestone canyons, where civilization clashes with the wild heart of the frontier, one woman's mixed heritage becomes both her greatest burden and her most unexpected salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of courage born from rejection, of love discovered in the most unlikely corners of a prejudiced world, and of two souls whose shared struggles with acceptance would forge a bond stronger than the very bedrock beneath the Texas soil. Here, where tumbleweeds dance with destiny and the echoes of ancient war cries still haunt the mesas, prepare to witness how the deepest wounds of the heart can become the foundation for the most extraordinary love. The autumn morning of 1878 found Ayanna Redfield standing at the cracked mirror in her cramped boarding house room in San Antonio, carefully braiding her long black hair into a style that might disguise its telltale texture. The morning light streaming through the grimy window caught the copper undertones that marked her as different, as dangerous to those who feared what they could not understand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned the braids into a neat coil, knowing that today would determine whether she would finally escape the suffocating walls of this frontier town or remain trapped forever in the shadows of her mixed heritage. At 23, Ayanna possessed a striking beauty that commanded attention wherever she went, but it was a beauty that came with a price. Her high cheekbones and almond-shaped dark eyes spoke of her Comanche mother's lineage, while her fair complexion and refined features reflected her father's English ancestry. This combination had made her an outcast in both worlds, too white for the Comanche, too Indian for white society. She had learned to navigate this precarious existence with careful precision, always aware that one wrong move, one moment of carelessness, could expose the truth that would destroy any chance at acceptance. The letter she had written 3 weeks prior lay open on the small wooden table beside her wash basin. The response she had been anxiously awaiting finally arrived yesterday evening. Jeremiah Morrison, proprietor of the Silver Creek Ranch in the remote territory near the New Mexico border, had accepted her proposal of correspondence marriage. His letter, written in a strong, confident hand, spoke of his need for a wife to help manage his growing cattle operation and bring refinement to his frontier home. He had been impressed by her educated writing and her claims of teaching experience, never suspecting that beneath her carefully crafted words lay a heritage that would have immediately disqualified her. In his eyes, Ayanna had been meticulous in her deception, crafting a background that painted her as the orphan daughter of English immigrants, educated in Eastern schools and seeking a fresh start in the West. She had practiced her story countless times, perfecting every detail until it felt as natural as breathing. The teaching experience she claimed was real enough. She had indeed worked as a tutor for several wealthy families in San Antonio, though they had believed her to be Spanish rather than part Comanche. Her fluency in English, Spanish, and her mother's native tongue had served her well in this charade, allowing her to adapt her story to whatever seemed most acceptable to her employers. The deception weighed heavily on her conscience, but the alternative was a lifetime of scraping by in San Antonio's shadows, taking whatever work she could find while hiding her true nature. She had watched too many of her mother's people struggle and starve, caught between two worlds that wanted nothing to do with them. Her mother, Ayanna now realized, had been wise to teach her the ways of both cultures, preparing her for a life that would require constant adaptation and careful navigation of dangerous social waters. Tessa Redfield had been barely 16 when she met Captain William Redfield during a trading expedition near the Llano Estacado. Their love affair had been passionate but brief, ending when William was transferred to a fort in Arizona Territory. Tessa had hidden her pregnancy from her tribe, knowing that a half-white child would face constant challenges, and had instead sought refuge with a Mexican family who took pity on her situation. When Ayanna was born, Tessa made the difficult decision to raise her daughter among the white settlements, believing it would give the child better opportunities than life with the increasingly marginalized Comanche bands. The years that followed had been a constant struggle for acceptance. Tessa worked as a seamstress and washwoman, always moving when people began to ask too many questions about her background. She taught Ayanna to read and write with fierce determination, scraping together money for books and paper, knowing that education would be her daughter's only path to a better life. When Tessa died of consumption 5 years earlier, Ayanna had been left truly alone in the world, with nothing but her mother's teachings and her own quick wit to sustain her. The boarding house around her was beginning to stir with the sounds of mourning boots on wooden floors, voices calling out greetings, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen below. Ayanna knew she needed to leave soon to catch the westbound stage that would take her to Silver Creek. She had sold nearly everything she owned to afford the passage, keeping only a small trunk containing her few good dresses, her mother's silver bracelet, the only link to her Comanche heritage, and the precious collection of books that had been her constant companions through the lonely years. As she finished her preparations, Ayanna caught sight of herself one final time in the cracked mirror. The woman looking back at her appeared entirely respectable, even refined. Her dark blue traveling dress was well made, though not expensive. Her hair was styled in the latest fashion, and her posture spoke of good breeding and education. No one looking at her would immediately suspect her dangerous secret, and she had become expert at deflecting questions about her family background with vague references to deceased parents and distant relatives. The stage station was already bustling with activity when Ayanna arrived, her small trunk in tow. The other passengers a traveling salesman, an elderly couple heading to visit their son, and a stern-faced woman who appeared to be a governess barely glanced at her as she took her assigned seat. This was always the most dangerous time, those first moments when people formed their initial impressions. Ayanna had learned to project an air of quiet respectability that discouraged too many personal questions while still appearing friendly enough to avoid suspicion. The journey to Silver Creek would take nearly a week, with stops in several smaller settlements along the way. Each stop would bring new challenges, new opportunities for someone to ask the wrong questions or notice something that didn't quite fit her carefully constructed story. But Ayanna had been preparing for this moment for years, and she was determined not to let fear derail her only chance at building a real life for herself. As the stage lurched into motion, carrying her away from the only home she had known, Ayanna allowed herself a moment of uncertainty. What would happen when Jeremiah Morrison discovered the truth about her heritage? Would he be like the others, immediately rejecting her once he learned of her Comanche blood? Or might he be different, a man capable of seeing past the prejudices that had shaped her entire existence? The landscape rolling past the stage window was harsh but beautiful, all red dirt and scrub brush punctuated by the occasional grove of live oaks. This was the country where her mother had been born, where the Comanche had once ruled vast territories, before being driven onto reservations by the advancing tide of white settlement. Ayanna felt a deep connection to this land that she could never fully express, a sense of belonging that transcended the social barriers that had defined her life. During the stops at way stations, she observed the other travelers and listened to their conversations, gathering information about the territory she was entering. Silver Creek, she learned, was a relatively new settlement, established only a few years earlier by ranchers seeking fresh grazing land. The town was small but growing, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and perhaps 30 or 40 families spread across the surrounding area. Jeremiah Morrison, according to the conversation she overheard, was something of a local success story. He had arrived in the territory with little more than determination and a small herd of cattle, building his ranch through hard work and shrewd business decisions. He was respected by his neighbors, known for his fair dealings and his willingness to help other settlers in times of trouble. But he was also known to be particular about social conventions, expecting his ranch hands to conduct themselves with dignity, and his home to reflect the civilized values he held dear. This information both encouraged and worried Ayanna. A man who valued respectability might appreciate her education and refinement, but he would also be exactly the type to reject her immediately if he discovered her mixed heritage. She would need to be extremely careful, at least until she could prove her worth as a wife and partner. Perhaps, if she demonstrated her value to his ranch and his life, he might be willing to overlook her background when the truth inevitably emerged. The other concern weighing on her mind was the reaction of the Silver Creek community itself. Small frontier towns could be particularly insular and suspicious of outsiders, especially those who didn't fit neatly into established social categories. She would need to quickly establish herself as a respectable member of the community, contributing to church activities and social gatherings, while carefully maintaining her fabricated background. As the stage continued its westward journey, Ayanna found herself rehearsing her story once again. She was the daughter of English immigrants who had died in a cholera outbreak when she was 15. She had been raised by a kind Mexican family who had educated her in exchange for helping with their younger children. When they had relocated to California, she had remained in Texas to pursue teaching opportunities. It was a story with just enough truth to feel natural and just enough tragedy to discourage too many follow-up questions. The silver bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve seemed to grow heavier with each mile, a tangible reminder of the heritage she was denying. Her mother had worn it every day of her life, and it had been crafted by Ayanna's grandmother, according to traditional Comanche methods. The intricate patterns etched into the metal told stories of courage and survival, of proud people who had refused to surrender their identity even in the face of overwhelming odds. Wearing it felt like carrying a piece of her mother's spirit with her, but it also represented the greatest threat to her carefully constructed new life. On the fourth day of travel, as they approached the final stage before Silver Creek, disaster nearly struck. During a stop at a trading post, an old Mexican woman approached Ayanna with a bright smile of recognition. The woman began speaking rapidly in Spanish, clearly mistaking Ayanna for someone she had known years earlier. The other passengers watched with interest as Ayanna politely but firmly explained that she was not the person the woman thought she was. The incident passed without serious consequence, but it served as a stark reminder of how easily her deception could unravel. That night, staying at a rough inn that served the stage route, Ayanna lay awake listening to the sounds of the frontier night coyotes calling in the distance, the wind rustling through the cottonwoods along the nearby creek, the occasional stamp of horses in the corral. Tomorrow she would reach Silver Creek and meet the man who would become her husband. She had spent 3 weeks imagining this moment, trying to prepare herself for every possible scenario. But now that it was almost upon her, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the deception she was attempting. The final morning of travel dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains appear close enough to touch. Silver Creek, when it finally came into view, was smaller than Ayanna had expected, but more prosperous looking than many frontier settlements. The main street was wide and well maintained, lined with sturdy wooden buildings that spoke of a community planning for permanent growth rather than temporary exploitation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the stage rolled to a stop in front of the general store that served as the town's unofficial center, Ayanna caught her first glimpse of the man who would shape her future. Jeremiah Morrison stood waiting beside a well-maintained wagon, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning sun. Even from a distance, she could see that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of weathered good looks that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His clothing was practical but well made, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to command. But there was something else about him, something that made Ayana's breath catch in her throat as she stepped down from the stage. In his features, she recognized the telltale signs of mixed heritage, the slight breadth of his cheekbones, the way his dark hair caught the light, the golden undertones in his skin that spoke of native ancestry carefully concealed beneath respectable frontier attire. Jeremiah Morrison, she realized with a shock of recognition and hope, was not the pure-blood white rancher she had expected to meet. He was, like her, caught between two worlds, walking the careful line between acceptance and exposure. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Ayana wondered if perhaps her desperate gamble might lead to something far more valuable than simple acceptance. It might lead to understanding, and perhaps even love, with someone who truly knew the burden she carried. The moment stretched between them like a taut bowstring, filled with unspoken understanding and shared recognition. Jeremiah Morrison's dark eyes searched Ayana's face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the startling realization that she was looking at someone who understood the delicate balance she maintained daily. The other stage passengers bustled around them, collecting their belongings and greeting relatives, but neither Ayana nor Jeremiah seemed capable of breaking the invisible thread that connected them across the dusty street. "Miss Redfield?" His voice carried a slight rasp, as if he too was struggling to process this unexpected development. When she nodded, he stepped forward with measured grace, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair that caught the sunlight. With auburn highlights, "I'm Jeremiah Morrison. Welcome to Silver Creek." His handshake was firm but brief, and Ayana noticed the calluses that spoke of years of hard ranch work. More importantly, she noticed how his fingers lingered just a moment, longer than propriety demanded, as if he were testing the reality of her presence. Up close, the evidence of his mixed heritage became even more apparent, the slight copper tint to his skin, the way his eyes held depths that spoke of ancient wisdom, the careful way he held himself that she recognized as the posture of someone always prepared to defend their right to exist in spaces where they might not be welcomed. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Morrison," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "Your letters painted such a vivid picture of this country. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." The lie came easily, a necessary social courtesy, but she could see in his expression that he heard something deeper in her words. Perhaps it was the way she pronounced certain syllables, or maybe the slight emphasis she placed on country rather than town. Whatever it was, she sensed his growing awareness that she, like him, carried secrets beneath her carefully constructed exterior. "Allow me to help you with your trunk," Jeremiah said, already moving toward the stage where her modest belongings waited. The ease with which he lifted the heavy case spoke of considerable strength, but it was the gentle care he took in handling her possessions that caught her attention. This was a man accustomed to treating things of value with respect, even when that value might not be immediately apparent to others. As they walked toward his wagon, Ayana became acutely aware of the attention their pairing was drawing from the residents of Silver Creek. Several women had emerged from the general store and were watching with barely concealed curiosity, their whispered conversations creating a soft buzz of speculation. She recognized the look in their eyes, the careful assessment that determined whether a newcomer would be accepted into their community or relegated to its margins. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the banker's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Silver Creek, approached with the kind of determined smile that Ayana had learned to fear. The woman's steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark dress spoke of Eastern sensibilities transplanted to the frontier. Everything about her demeanor suggested she considered herself the guardian of the town's moral standards. "Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Whitmore said with forced warmth, "you simply must introduce us to your charming guest." The emphasis on guest carried just enough weight to make clear her expectation that proper courtship protocols would be observed. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I present Miss Ayanna Redfield?" Jeremiah replied with careful formality. "Miss Redfield has traveled from San Antonio to consider my proposal of marriage." His directness clearly surprised Mrs. Whitmore, who had evidently expected a more gradual revelation of their arrangement. Ayanna curtsied slightly, drawing on years of observing proper social behavior. "I'm delighted to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Morrison's correspondence has given me such hope for finding a true home here in Silver Creek." Mrs. Whitmore's sharp eyes studied Ayanna's face with uncomfortable intensity, clearly trying to place her features in some familiar category. "Redfield," she mused aloud. "I don't believe I'm familiar with that family name. Are you perhaps related to the Redfields of Austin?" The question was a trap, designed to establish Ayanna's social credentials and family connections. "I'm afraid not," Ayanna replied smoothly. "My parents were English immigrants who settled briefly in East Texas before the fever took them." She allowed just enough pain to enter her voice to discourage further questions about her family background. "How tragic," Mrs. Whitmore said, with what might have been genuine sympathy. "And you've been managing on your own since then? Such courage for one so young." The compliment carried an undertone of suspicion. In Mrs. Whitmore's world, respectable young women did not travel unaccompanied across dangerous territory to marry strangers. "Miss Redfield has been supporting herself as a teacher," Jeremiah interjected, his tone carrying a subtle warning. "Her education and accomplishments speak well of her character." It was a gentle but firm defense, and Ayanna felt a surge of gratitude for his intervention. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Whitmore probing delicately for information about Ayanna's background while Jeremiah deftly redirected the most invasive questions. Finally, citing the need to reach his ranch before sunset, he guided Ayanna toward his wagon with polite but unmistakable finality. As they drove away from the settlement, the tension that had gripped Ayanna's shoulders began to ease slightly. The immediate social trial was behind her, though she knew it was only the first of many such encounters she would face. Silver Creek appeared to be the type of community where everyone's business was considered everyone else's concern, and establishing her respectability would require constant vigilance. "Mrs. Whitmore means well," Jeremiah said after they had traveled in comfortable silence for several minutes. "But she tends to view any change to our community with suspicion. Don't let her manner discourage you." "I've encountered her type before," Ayanna replied carefully. "I understand the need to protect one's community from undesirable influences." She chose her words deliberately, curious to see how he would respond to the implicit acknowledgement of the social dynamics at play. Jeremiah's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "Sometimes the people we're protecting ourselves from are the ones who understand us best," he said quietly. The comment hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither was quite ready to address directly. The landscape they traveled through was breathtaking in its stark beauty. Rolling hills covered in native grasses stretched toward distant mesas, while ancient oak trees marked the paths of hidden streams. This was land that had been shaped by wind and weather into something that spoke to the soul rather than merely pleasing the eye. Ayanna found herself responding to it in ways that surprised her, a deep sense of rightness, as if she were finally seeing the country that matched something fundamental in her nature. "Your letters mentioned cattle ranching," she said, seeking safer conversational ground. "Have you been in this business long?" "About 6 years now," Jeremiah replied, his voice warming as he discussed his work. "I started with a small herd and barely enough money to buy supplies. The land here wasn't considered prime grazing territory, which made it affordable for someone like me. Again, that careful phrasing suggested layers of meaning beneath the surface. Someone like you? Ayanna asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon as if weighing his words. Carefully. Someone without the family connections or established reputation that usually makes success in this business easier, he finally said. I've had to prove myself through results rather than relationships. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging the barriers he had faced without directly admitting to the heritage that likely created them. Ayanna recognized the careful balance he was maintaining, honest enough to be truthful, vague enough to avoid dangerous specifics. She had spent years perfecting similar verbal dances herself. Hard work and determination can overcome many obstacles, she said, offering support without pushing for details he wasn't ready to share. Your success speaks well of your character and abilities. The ranch, when it finally came into view, exceeded Ayanna's expectations in every way. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built from local limestone, with a wide covered porch that promised cool evenings and protection from summer storms. Outbuildings dotted the landscape in logical arrangements, a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for ranch hands, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything spoke of careful planning and steady prosperity. But what struck Ayanna most powerfully was how the ranch seemed to blend into the natural landscape rather than imposing itself upon it. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources, while the corrals were placed to minimize impact on the native vegetation. This was the work of someone who understood and respected the land rather than simply seeking to dominate it. It's magnificent, she said, and for once the praise was entirely genuine. You've built something remarkable here. Jeremiah's pleasure at her reaction was obvious, though he tried to downplay his accomplishment. The land did most of the work. I just tried not to interfere with what it wanted to become. The comment revealed more about his philosophy than perhaps he intended. This was a man who believed in working with natural forces rather than against them. Several ranch hands had gathered near the main corral to observe their arrival. Their curious glances taking in every detail of Ayanna's appearance and demeanor. She recognized the mixture of respect and wariness in their expressions. These men clearly held their employer in high regard, but they were protective of his interests and suspicious of potential threats to his well-being. The foreman, a weathered man with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped forward to greet them. Miss, this here's Miguel Santos, Jeremiah said by way of introduction. He keeps this place running when I'm too stubborn to listen to good advice. Miguel's smile was genuine as he removed his hat respectfully. Senorita Redfield, welcome to the Morrison Ranch. We have been curious to meet the lady who captured our boss's attention. His slight accent and comfortable familiarity with Jeremiah suggested a relationship built on mutual respect rather than mere employment. The pleasure is mine, Mr. Santos, Ayanna replied in flawless Spanish, then continued in English. Mr. Morrison's letters spoke often of his excellent crew. It's clear he wasn't exaggerating. The brief exchange in Spanish had an interesting effect on the gathered men. Several exchanged meaningful glances, while Miguel's expression shifted to one of surprised approval. Jeremiah, she noticed, was watching her with new intensity, clearly processing this additional piece of information about her background. You speak Spanish beautifully, he commented as Miguel helped them unload her trunk. Where did you learn? This was dangerous territory, requiring her to venture closer to the truth than she preferred. The family who took me in after my parents died were Mexican, she said carefully. They were very kind to me, and I picked up the language naturally. It was true enough, though it omitted the more complex reality of her mother's relationships with various communities along the frontier. Tessa Redfield had been skilled at finding sanctuary with Mexican families who were more accepting of mixed marriages and children of uncertain parentage. As they approached the main house, Ayanna caught sight of a figure watching from an upstairs window, a woman with silver hair and sharp features who disappeared from view as soon as she realized she had been observed. The brief glimpse suggested someone older, perhaps a housekeeper or relative, though Jeremiah had mentioned no family members in his letters. That would be Mrs. Elena Vasquez, Jeremiah explained, having followed her glance. She's been managing the household since I built this place. Her late husband worked for me in the early days, and when he passed, she refused to leave. She claims the house would fall apart without her supervision, and I've learned not to argue with her assessment. The fondness in his voice suggested a relationship based on genuine affection rather than mere convenience. It also hinted at Jeremiah's character, a man who honored loyalty and cared for those who depended on him, qualities that Ayanna found deeply appealing. Mrs. Vasquez met them at the front door, her stern expression softening slightly as she studied Ayanna with shrewd but not unkind eyes. Unlike Mrs. Whitmore's suspicious probing, the older woman's assessment seemed focused on practical matters. Was this newcomer someone who would treat her employer well and contribute positively to the household? "Senorita," she said with formal politeness, "your room is prepared. Would you prefer to rest from your journey, or would you like to see the house first?" "I'd love to see the house, if that wouldn't be an imposition," Ayanna replied. "Mr. Morrison's descriptions made me quite curious about his home." Mrs. Vasquez nodded approvingly. Clearly, this was the correct answer from someone who might become mistress of the household. As they toured the rooms, Ayanna was struck by the thoughtful details throughout the house. The furniture was well made but comfortable, clearly chosen for durability and function rather than mere display. Books lined the shelves in the main room, suggesting an educated owner who valued learning. Most remarkably, subtle decorative elements throughout the house showed influences that transcended purely European traditions: pottery that spoke of native craftsmanship, textiles that reflected Mexican artistry, and architectural details that suggested someone who appreciated beauty regardless of its cultural origins. The guest room where she would stay was spacious and comfortable, with large windows that provided stunning views of the surrounding landscape. Mrs. Vasquez had placed fresh wildflowers in a simple vase on the bedside table, a touch that spoke of genuine hospitality rather than mere obligation. "Dinner will be ready in an hour," Mrs. Vasquez announced as she prepared to leave Ayanna to settle in. "We eat simply here, but there is always plenty." She paused at the door, studying Ayanna with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to making quick but accurate judgments about character. "Senator Morrison is a good man," she said finally. "He deserves happiness." The comment was both a welcome and a warning. Mrs. Vasquez was prepared to accept Ayanna into the household, but any betrayal of her employer's trust would not be tolerated. It was a position Ayanna could respect and appreciate, even as it added another layer of pressure to her already precarious situation. Alone in the room, Ayanna finally allowed herself to fully process the extraordinary developments of the day. Not only had she successfully navigated the initial social challenges of arriving in Silver Creek, but she had discovered that Jeremiah Morrison shared the burden of concealed heritage that had shaped her entire existence. The recognition she had seen in his eyes, the careful way he spoke about his background, the subtle evidence of mixed cultural influences throughout his home, everything pointed to a man who, like her, had learned to walk the dangerous line between authenticity and acceptance. But this revelation, while offering hope for understanding and connection, also brought new dangers. If Jeremiah's own position in the community was more precarious than it appeared, her presence might threaten the careful balance he had achieved. And if her deception was discovered, it would not only destroy her own prospects, but potentially damage his standing as well. As she unpacked her few belongings, carefully hiding her mother's silver bracelet beneath her other jewelry, Ayanna found herself facing a dilemma she had not anticipated. She had come to Silver Creek expecting to perpetuate her deception indefinitely, maintaining her fabricated identity until it became so established that the truth could never surface. But the possibility of genuine connection with someone who might actually understand her struggle introduced complications she had never considered. Could she build a real marriage on the foundation of a lie, even if that lie was designed to protect them both? And more importantly, did she have the right to make that choice for Jeremiah, who clearly had his own reasons for maintaining careful boundaries around his personal history? The sound of approaching horses drew her to the window, where she observed several riders arriving at the ranch. Even from a distance, she could sense tension in their posture and urgency in their movements. Whatever news they brought, it was clearly not welcome, and Ayanna felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. In her experience, unexpected visitors rarely brought good fortune to those already walking on dangerous ground. The riders brought news that changed everything. From her window, Ayanna watched as Jeremiah strode across the yard to meet them, his easy confidence replaced by a tension she could feel even at this distance. The lead rider, a gaunt man with a star pinned to his dust-covered vest, dismounted with the weary movements of someone who had been traveling hard for days. Their conversation was brief but intense, punctuated by sharp gestures toward the eastern horizon where storm clouds were gathering both literally and figuratively. When Jeremiah returned to the house 20 minutes later, his face carried the weight of unwelcome revelations. Mrs. Vasquez appeared instantly, as if she had been waiting just out of sight, her experienced eyes reading trouble in every line of his posture. The whispered exchange between them was conducted in rapid Spanish, too quick for Ayanna to follow completely, but she caught enough words to understand that danger was approaching their peaceful valley. "Miss Redfield," Jeremiah called up the stairs, his voice carefully controlled. "Would you join me in the parlor? There are matters we need to discuss." The formal tone sent a chill through Ayanna's chest. During their journey from town, she had grown accustomed to the warmth that seemed to underlie his every interaction with her. This sudden distance suggested that whatever news the riders had brought, it directly affected her presence at the ranch. She found him standing before the massive stone fireplace, one hand braced against the mantelpiece as he stared into the cold ashes from the previous evening's fire. The late afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the tension in his shoulders and the grim set of his jaw. When he turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, not suspicion exactly, but a careful evaluation that suggested he was seeing her with new clarity. "The men who just left were a federal marshal and his deputy," Jeremiah began without preamble. "They're tracking a gang of renegades who've been raiding settlements between here and the Rio Grande. The leader is a half-breed named Joseph Crow Feather, and they believe he may be heading this direction." Ayanna's blood turned to ice water. Joseph Crow Feather had been her mother's cousin, a man who had chosen violence over accommodation when the Comanche were forced onto reservations. The last time she had seen him, she was 14 years old, and he was warning her mother that their family's attempts to live among white settlements would eventually bring disaster to them all. His prediction had proven terrifyingly accurate. "That name means something to you," Jeremiah observed, his sharp eyes missing nothing in her expression. "It wasn't a question. Ayanna struggled to find words that wouldn't expose too much while still being truthful. "I may have heard it mentioned years ago. There were stories about raiders in East Texas, but I thought those troubles had ended." Jeremiah studied her face for a long moment, and she could practically see him weighing her words against his own knowledge and suspicions. "The marshal was very specific about Crow Feather's methods," he said carefully. "He has a particular hatred for mixed-blood families who try to integrate into white communities. Considers them traitors to their heritage." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a green fire, thick, choking, and impossible to ignore. Jeremiah knew exactly what Joseph's presence in the territory meant for anyone carrying native blood. and his careful phrasing suggested he was offering her an opportunity to reveal her own situation before circumstances forced the truth into the open. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are things about my background that I haven't been entirely forthcoming about. I never intended to deceive you maliciously, but survival sometimes requires careful editing of the truth," he finished gently. "I understand that necessity better than you might imagine." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. She had been prepared for anger, rejection, even disgust, but not for this patient understanding that spoke of his own familiarity with impossible choices. "My mother was Comanche," she said simply, the words falling into the space between them, like stones into still water. "My father was a cavalry officer who never knew I existed. I've spent my entire adult life hiding that heritage because I learned early that honesty about such things is a luxury I couldn't afford." Jeremiah nodded slowly, as if her confession confirmed suspicions he had been harboring since their first meeting. "My grandmother was Apache," he said quietly. "My grandfather bought her from Comancheros when she was barely 15, married her in a Catholic ceremony, and spent the rest of his life protecting her from people who would have destroyed them both for that choice. My father inherited that burden, and now it falls to me." The relief that flooded through Ayanna was so intense it left her lightheaded. Not only did Jeremiah understand her deception, but he shared the fundamental challenge that had shaped her entire existence. They were both products of two worlds, forever walking the knife's edge between acceptance and exposure. "The marshal doesn't know about your heritage?" she asked. "Federal lawmen tend to be more pragmatic than local communities," Jeremiah replied. "They care more about results than bloodlines, as long as you're on the right side of their investigations. But that tolerance has limits, especially when dealing with Indian troubles." A new thought struck Ayanna with sickening force. If Joseph Crowfeather is targeting mixed families, and if he somehow discovers my presence here, he could use you to draw me into a confrontation, Jeremiah finished grimly. "Or worse, he might see you as exactly the kind of traitor he's dedicated his life to punishing." Mrs. Vasquez appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their mutual distress, carrying a tea service that neither of them wanted, but both desperately needed. Her dark eyes moved between them with shrewd understanding, and Ayanna realized that the older woman had probably known the truth about both their backgrounds from the beginning. "The vaqueros are bringing the cattle closer to the ranch, Mrs. Vasquez reported as she set down the tray. "Miguel has stationed extra guards at the boundary markers. The men are good fighters, but they are not soldiers." "How long before Crowfeather reaches this area?" Ayanna asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "The marshal estimates 3 days, maybe 4 if they stop to raid the Henderson place," Jeremiah replied. "That gives us time to make preparations, but not enough to get you safely away from here." "I'm not leaving," Ayanna said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her declaration. "Running would only confirm his suspicions about me, and it would leave you to face this threat alone." Jeremiah's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration mixed with exasperation. "Miss Redfield, Ayanna, you don't understand what you're suggesting. Crowfeather isn't just a raider. He's a man driven by a very specific kind of hatred. And that hatred focuses particularly on women like you who have chosen to live among white communities." "Then perhaps it's time someone stood up to that hatred," she replied, her mother's stubborn courage rising in her chest like a tide. "I've spent my entire life hiding from who I am, letting fear dictate every choice I make. Maybe that changes now." Mrs. Vasquez made a sound that might have been approval or concern, while Jeremiah ran a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. "This isn't about courage, Ayanna. It's about survival. And survival sometimes means choosing your battles carefully. I chose my battle the moment I stepped off that stage in Silver Creek," she said quietly. "I chose it when I decided to stop running from my heritage and start looking for a place where it might actually be accepted. The conversation was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. Miguel Santos burst through the front door without ceremony, his usually calm demeanor replaced by urgent alarm. "Patron, riders approaching from the south. Not crow feathers. Banned, but they're flying military colors." Jeremir's jaw tightened. "Captain Morrison?" he asked grimly. "See, looks like your brother has finally decided to pay a visit." Ayanna felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Jeremir had never mentioned having a brother, much less one in the military. The careful way Miguel had phrased his announcement suggested this was not a welcome family reunion. "Your brother is a cavalry officer?" she asked. "Captain Daniel Morrison, currently stationed at Fort Conco," Jeremir replied, his voice flat with suppressed emotion. "We haven't spoken in 5 years, not since he made it clear that my choice to live openly with my mixed heritage was an embarrassment to the family name." Through the window, Ayanna could see a small column of soldiers approaching the ranch house. The officer leading them sat his horse with military precision, his uniform crisp despite the long ride. Even at a distance, she could see the family resemblance, the same tall frame, the same strong jawline, but where Jeremir carried himself with quiet confidence, this man projected an authority that seemed designed to intimidate. "He's heard about Crowfeather," Jeremir said grimly. "The question is whether he's here to help or to make sure I don't complicate the Army's efforts to capture him." Captain Daniel Morrison dismounted with parade ground precision, handing his reins to one of his men before striding toward the house. His gaze swept the ranch buildings with professional assessment, noting defensive positions and potential vulnerabilities. When his eyes fell on Ayanna standing beside his brother, she saw a flicker of surprise followed by what might have been a concern. "Jeremir," he said with formal politeness as he climbed the porch steps, "I see you have company." "Miss Ayanna Redfield," Jeremir replied with equal formality, "my intended bride." "Ayanna, this is my brother Daniel." The introduction hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel's sharp eyes studied Ayanna's face with uncomfortable intensity, clearly cataloging features and drawing conclusions about her heritage. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his obvious suspicions. "Miss Redfield," Daniel said with a slight bow, "I trust your journey to Silver Creek was pleasant?" "Quite pleasant, thank you," she replied smoothly. "Your brother has been most welcoming. I'm sure he has." The comment carried an undertone that suggested Daniel's opinion of his brother's hospitality was not entirely favorable. "Jeremir, we need to talk, privately." "Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Miss Redfield," Jeremir replied evenly. "She's going to be part of this family after all." Daniel's expression tightened. "Very well. I'm here because Washington is concerned about the deteriorating situation in this territory. Crowfeather's raids are drawing unwanted attention from Eastern newspapers, and there's pressure to resolve this matter quickly and decisively." "Meaning?" "Meaning the Army is prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to Crowfeather's capture or death. We're also prepared to provide protection for any civilians who might be targeted because of their ... connections to the situation." The euphemism was delicate but unmistakable. Daniel was offering to protect his brother and Ayanna because of their mixed heritage, but only if they cooperated with military objectives that might conflict with their own survival strategies. "And what would that cooperation entail?" Jeremir asked carefully. "Full disclosure of any contact you might have had with Crowfeather or his associates. Complete transparency about your activities in this territory. And assurance that you won't interfere with military operations, even if those operations involve actions you might find personally objectionable." Ayanna felt ice forming in her stomach. Daniel was essentially asking them to betray any Comanche or Apache who might seek shelter or assistance, regardless of their involvement with Crowfeather's raiding. It was the kind of blanket collaboration that would destroy any remaining connections to their native heritage while potentially endangering innocent people. "I appreciate the Army's concern," Jeremiah said with dangerous quiet, "but I've managed to survive in this territory for 6 years without compromising my principles. I don't intend to start now." Daniel's patience visibly frayed. "This isn't about principles, Jeremiah. It's about reality. Crow Feather has made it clear that he considers people like you to be legitimate targets. Your ranch, your livestock, your—" His gaze flicked toward Ayanna. "Your household are all at risk." "Then I'll defend them," Jeremiah replied simply. "Against a war band of experienced fighters? With a handful of ranch hands and—" Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied Ayanna again. Whatever assistance Miss Redfield might provide. The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Ayanna felt her temper flare. "I may not be a soldier, Captain Morrison, but I'm not helpless either. And I certainly won't be responsible for your brother compromising his integrity to satisfy military expedience." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly at her spirited response. "Miss Redfield, I mean no disrespect, but this situation is more dangerous than you realize. Crow Feather doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians when it comes to people he considers traitors to their heritage." "Then perhaps," Ayanna said quietly, "it's time someone taught him that heritage isn't defined by hatred or by hiding from who we are." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and both brothers stared at her with expressions of mingled admiration and alarm. She had essentially declared her intention to stand and fight rather than flee or compromise, a position that would force them all to confront the fundamental question of how much they were willing to sacrifice to maintain their carefully constructed lives. Daniel looked between his brother and Ayanna with growing frustration. "You're both going to get yourselves killed," he said bluntly. "And when that happens, the Army will have no choice but to treat this ranch as a hostile position that aided and abetted known renegades. Is that a threat, Daniel?" Jeremiah asked. Softly, "It's a warning," his brother replied. "The same warning I would give to anyone foolish enough to think they can face this situation alone." But as the two brothers faced each other across the widening gulf of their different choices, Ayanna realized that none of them truly understood the full scope of the danger approaching Silver Creek. Joseph Crow Feather wasn't just a renegade raider seeking revenge against mixed-blood families. He was a man who had lost everything to the advancing tide of white settlement, and who now saw the destruction of those who tried to bridge both worlds as his sacred mission. And somewhere in the gathering darkness beyond the ranch boundaries, he was coming for them all. The tension that had been building since Captain Morrison's arrival reached a breaking point the following morning when Miguel Santos discovered fresh tracks along the eastern boundary of the ranch. The unshod hoofprints and distinctive markings told a story that chilled everyone who could read such signs. Joseph Crow Feather's scouts had been watching the Morrison ranch throughout the night, cataloging defenses and counting the number of people inside the compound. Ayanna stood in the ranch kitchen beside Mrs. Vasquez, methodically cleaning and checking the small arsenal of weapons that had been assembled on the sturdy wooden table. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, a skill learned during the dangerous years when her mother had moved them frequently between settlements, always prepared for the possibility that their carefully constructed lies might unravel and force them to defend themselves. "Your mother taught you to handle firearms," Mrs. Vasquez observed. Noting the confident way Ayanna examined the cylinder of a Colt revolver. It wasn't a question. The older woman's sharp eyes missed very little when it came to reading people's histories. She said a woman who couldn't protect herself was at the mercy of every man who wanted to use her. Ayanna replied, checking the weapon's action with movements that spoke of long familiarity. Tessa Redfield may have chosen to live in white settlements, but she never forgot the lessons her own mother taught her about survival. Through the kitchen window, they could see Jeremiah and his brother engaged in heated discussion near the main corral. Daniel's military bearing contrasted sharply with Jeremiah's relaxed rancher's stance, but the tension between them was visible even at this distance. Their argument had been raging intermittently since dawn, centering on Daniel's insistence that the ranch should be evacuated, and Jeremiah's equally firm refusal to abandon everything he had built. "The captain, he does not understand," Mrs. Vasquez said softly, following Ayana's gaze. "For him, this is one battle among many. For Senator Morrison, this is his life, his home, his future. A man cannot simply walk away from such things and remain a man." The profound truth in those words resonated deeply with Ayana. She had spent her entire adult life walking away from challenges, changing her identity and location whenever the pressure of maintaining her deception became too great. But something had shifted inside her since arriving at the Morrison Ranch, whether it was Jeremiah's quiet strength, the acceptance she had found among his people, or simply the exhaustion of carrying her secret alone. She found herself unwilling to run again. A commotion outside drew their attention to the yard, where one of the ranch hands was leading a lathered horse toward the barn. The rider who dismounted was unfamiliar to Ayana. A young Mexican man whose clothes and equipment suggested he had ridden hard through dangerous territory to reach them. His urgent conversation with Miguel Santos was conducted in rapid Spanish that carried across the morning air like gunfire. "What news does he bring?" Ayana asked, though the tension in Mrs. Vasquez's face already suggested the answer would not be welcome. "The Henderson Ranch was hit before dawn," the older woman translated grimly. "3 dead, the house burned, cattle scattered. Joseph Crow Feather left a message carved into what remained of the front door." Ayana's blood chilled. "What did it say?" "The half-blood traitors will burn next." Mrs. Vasquez crossed herself reflexively. The Hendersons were good people, but the old man had Cherokee blood. His wife knew the risks when she married him, but love makes fools of us all. The brutal reality of their situation crystallized in Ayana's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't simply about raiding for horses and cattle. Joseph Crow Feather was conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing, systematically targeting anyone who represented the mixing of native and white bloodlines. The fact that he had specifically mentioned half-blood traitors meant he knew about both Jeremiah's heritage and her own presence at the ranch. Daniel Morrison's voice rose sharply in the yard as Miguel delivered the news about the Henderson place. The captain's military training was clearly warring with his concern for his brother's safety, creating a conflict that showed in every tense line of his body. When he gestured emphatically toward his small troop of soldiers, Ayana could read the argument even without hearing the words. He was offering to escort them to safety at Fort Conco, an offer that Jeremiah was obviously rejecting. "Your intended husband is a stubborn man," Mrs. Vasquez observed with what might have been admiration. "Like his grandfather, who would not bend even when bending might have saved lives." "Tell me about his grandfather," Ayana said, recognizing an opportunity to better understand the man she was supposed to marry. Jeremiah mentioned him briefly, but ... Mrs. Vasquez settled into a chair beside the kitchen table, her weathered hands folding over her apron as she prepared to share a story that clearly held deep significance for her. "Don Eduardo Morrison was a man caught between worlds, much like you and Senator Jeremiah. He came to this territory as a young soldier, but when he met Esperanza, everything changed." The older woman's eyes grew distant as she recalled events from decades past. Esperanza was Apache, captured during a raid and sold to Comancheros. Don Eduardo bought her freedom, but instead of simply releasing her, he fell in love. Their marriage scandalized everyone: the army, the Mexican authorities, the local settlers. But Don Eduardo was a man of principle. He resigned his commission, used his savings to buy land, and built a life where his wife could be herself without fear. "What happened to them?" Ayana asked, though she suspected the story didn't have a happy ending. "They had 20 good years together before the Apache Wars intensified. Esperanza was killed during a raid on a neighboring ranch, not by her own people, but by white settlers who saw her as a threat because of her heritage. Don Eduardo never recovered from the loss. He died 5 years later, leaving behind only his son and the determination that his family would never again hide who they were. The story illuminated much about Jeremir's character that had puzzled Ayana since her arrival. His willingness to live openly with his mixed heritage, his careful balance between accommodation and authenticity, his absolute refusal to compromise. His principles even in the face of mortal danger, all of it reflected lessons learned from his grandfather's tragic example. And now Joseph Crow Feather threatens to destroy what 3 generations of the Morrison family have built, Ayana said. Quietly. "See," Mrs. Vasquez agreed sadly. "But perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps this time, love will prove stronger than hatred." The kitchen door burst open as Miguel Santos entered with obvious urgency. His usually composed demeanor had been replaced by the kind of controlled alarm that suggested immediate danger. "Señora Senorita, you must come quickly. There is something you need to see." They followed him outside to where Jeremir and Daniel were examining something that one of the scouts had discovered near the main gate. As they approached, Ayana could see it was a message of sorts, a collection of items, arranged in a pattern that would be meaningless to most white observers, but carried deadly significance for anyone familiar with Plains Indian communication. Methods: a broken arrow pointed toward the house, its shaft painted with red ochre that symbolized blood and death. Beside it lay a small piece of blue cloth that looked suspiciously like it had been torn from a woman's dress. Most ominous of all was a silver canco bearing traditional Comanche designs, positioned to catch the morning sunlight in a way that would make it visible from a considerable distance. "He knows you're here," Jeremir said quietly to Ayana, his voice carrying a weight of resignation and determination. "The cloth and the silver work, those are meant specifically for you." Daniel's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. "This changes everything. If Crow Feather is targeting Miss Redfield specifically, we can't simply defend this position. We need to evacuate her immediately." "No," Ayana said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "I won't run anymore. I won't let fear dictate my choices or put other people at risk because of my heritage." "Miss Redfield," Daniel began with forced patience, "you don't understand the tactical situation. Crow Feather has chosen this ground because it favors his methods of warfare. The ranch is isolated, defensible to a point, but ultimately vulnerable to the kind of sustained assault he specializes in." "Then we make our stand here," Jeremir said quietly, his decision clearly made. "This is our home, our land, our life. If Joseph Crow Feather wants to destroy it, he'll have to go through all of us to do it." The declaration sent a chill through the assembled group. Mrs. Vasquez crossed herself again while Miguel nodded grimly, already calculating defensive positions and ammunition supplies. Daniel's expression shifted through frustration, resignation, and finally a kind of reluctant admiration for his brother's unwavering resolve. "If you're determined to make this fight," the captain said finally, "then we need to do it properly. My men are trained soldiers, not ranch hands. We can establish proper defensive positions, coordinate fields of fire, set up early warning systems. Your men didn't sign up to protect civilians in a private dispute," Jeremir pointed out. "They signed up to serve the United States Army," Daniel replied with military precision. "Right now, stopping Joseph Crow Feather serves the Army's interests. The specific tactics we use to accomplish that mission are within my discretionary authority." It was a thin justification that probably wouldn't hold up under official scrutiny, but it offered a legal framework for Daniel to help defend the ranch without openly defying his orders. The brothers looked at each other across years of estrangement and fundamental disagreement, finding common ground in the immediate need to protect the people and place they both cared about. The next several hours passed in a blur of military style. Preparation. Daniel's soldiers worked with Miguel's ranch hands to establish defensive positions around the compound, using their knowledge of army tactics to create interlocking fields of fire that would maximize their defensive advantages. Ammunition was distributed, escape routes were planned, and contingency plans were developed for various assault scenarios. Ayana found herself assigned to the ranch house itself, where her primary responsibility would be to protect Mrs. Vasquez and maintain communication between the various defensive positions. It was a role that kept her relatively safe while acknowledging her shooting skills, and she suspected it had been carefully chosen to satisfy both Jeremir's protective instincts and her own insistence on participating in the defense. As afternoon faded toward evening, the ranch took on the appearance of a military installation preparing for siege. Sentries were posted at strategic locations, horses were moved to protected areas, and essential supplies were stockpiled in the main house. The normal rhythms of ranch life had been replaced by the controlled tension of soldiers preparing for battle. "Do you think he'll come tonight?" Ayana asked Jeremir as they stood together on the front porch, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded their valley. "Joseph operates by his own rules and timing," Jeremir replied thoughtfully. "He might wait days to let the tension build, or he might strike before we finish our preparations. The uncertainty is part of his strategy. It wears down defenders and creates opportunities for mistakes." "You sound like you know him personally." Jeremir was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant ridgeline, where the last light of day was painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "I met him once, years ago, when I was still trying to maintain connections with both sides of my heritage. He was different then. Angry, yes, but not consumed by the kind of hatred that drives him now." "What changed him?" "The same thing that could have changed any of us," Jeremir said sadly. "Too much loss, too much betrayal, too many promises broken by people he trusted. When a man loses everything that defined his identity, sometimes he replaces it with something darker." The observation carried weight beyond its immediate context. Ayana recognized the implicit warning. Under different circumstances, with different choices, any of them could have followed the same path that had led Joseph Crowfeather to become a figure of terror throughout the territory. A shout from one of the sentries interrupted their contemplation. Riders were approaching from the north, moving fast and making no attempt at concealment. For a moment, everyone tensed for the assault they had been expecting, but the riders carried torches and flew a white flag that suggested parley rather than attack. "He wants to talk," Daniel observed grimly as he joined them on the porch. "That's either very good news or very bad news, and I'm not sure which." The small party of riders stopped just beyond rifle range, their torches creating pools of flickering light in the gathering darkness. One figure separated from the group and rode slowly forward, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. Even at this distance, there was no mistaking the proud bearing and commanding presence of Joseph Crowfeather. "I would speak with the woman who hides behind a white man's name." His voice carried clearly across the evening air, speaking in the Comanche language that Ayana understood perfectly. "Let her face the judgment of her own people." The challenge was unmistakable, and every eye on the ranch turned toward Ayana. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. The choice between the safety of continued deception and the terrible honesty of claiming her true heritage in the face of mortal danger. "What is he saying?" Daniel asked urgently. Ayana took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her mother's silver bracelet against her wrist like an anchor to her true identity. "He's calling me out," she said quietly. "He wants me to face him as a Comanche woman, not as the white settler I've been pretending to be." "You're not going out there," Jeremir said firmly. "Actually," Ayana replied, surprising herself with her calm certainty, "I think that's exactly what I'm going to do." The silence that followed Ayana's declaration stretched like a bowstring, drawn to its breaking point. Every person on the ranch, soldiers, ranch hands, and family alike, stared at her with expressions ranging from admiration to outright horror. The idea of walking into the darkness to face Joseph Crowfeather seemed like suicide discouraged, yet something in Ayana's bearing suggested this wasn't the desperate gesture it appeared to be. "Absolutely not," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had built his ranch from nothing. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself to satisfy his twisted sense of justice." "It's not about sacrifice," Ayana replied, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the silver bracelet hidden beneath her sleeve. "It's about finally being honest about who I am. I've spent my entire life running from my heritage, letting fear dictate my choices. But maybe the only way to end this cycle is to face it directly." Daniel Morrison stepped forward. His military training wore in with growing understanding of the cultural complexities at play. "Miss Redfield, I've seen what Crowfeather does to people he considers traitors. There's no negotiating with that kind of fanaticism." "Perhaps not," Ayana acknowledged. "But there might be a way to reach the man he was before hatred consumed him." Jeremiah said he wasn't always like this. "Maybe if I can speak to him in the language of our shared heritage, remind him of what we're really fighting for." Mrs. Vasquez had been listening to the exchange with the patient, attention of someone who had witnessed decades of similar conflicts. Now she spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "In the old days, before the reservations, disputes like this were sometimes settled by single combat or formal challenge. If the senorita can invoke those traditions, it could work," Miguel Santos added thoughtfully. "Crowfeather still honors the old ways, even as he uses them to justify violence. If she approaches him correctly, speaks the proper words, he might be bound by custom to hear her out." Jeremiah's expression made it clear he considered this cultural theorizing academic at best and suicidal at worst. "You're talking about gambling her life on the possibility that a man who spent years killing innocent people might suddenly rediscover his honor." "I'm talking about giving him an opportunity to choose a different path," Ayana corrected gently. "And if he refuses that opportunity, at least we'll know we tried everything before this becomes a war that destroys everyone we care about." The debate might have continued indefinitely, but Joseph Crowfeather's voice cut through the night air again, this time speaking English with deliberate precision. "I will wait until the moon reaches its highest point. If the woman does not come to face judgment by then, I will consider all who shelter her to be enemies of the Comanche people." The ultimatum shifted the entire dynamic of their situation. Instead of having time to prepare defenses and plan strategies, they now faced a deadline that forced immediate decision-making. Daniel consulted his pocket watch grimly. They had perhaps 2 hours before moonrise. "If you're determined to do this," Jeremiah said finally, his voice heavy with resignation and fear, "then you won't go out there defenseless. And you won't go alone." "The challenge was directed specifically at me," Ayana protested. "If you come with me, it changes the nature of the encounter entirely." "I'm not suggesting I accompany you to the meeting," Jeremiah clarified. "But there are preparations we can make, precautions we can take, ways to give you advantages that don't violate the traditional protocols." Mrs. Vasquez nodded approvingly. "Your mother's people had rituals for such moments, yes? Ways of invoking protection and demonstrating respect for the old customs?" Ayana felt a flutter of memory half-forgotten ceremonies her mother had whispered about during the darkest nights of their wandering years. Tessa Redfield had been careful never to practice the old rituals openly, but she had made sure her daughter understood their significance and power. "There are certain preparations that could be made," she admitted. "Then we make them," Jeremiah said firmly. "Mrs. Vasquez, gather what we'll need for traditional Comanche ceremonial dress." "Miguel," I want torches positioned to provide clear sight lines during the meeting. Daniel, your men are to remain completely out of sight but ready to respond if this goes badly. The next hour transformed the ranch into a hive of purposeful activity. Mrs. Vasquez, drawing on knowledge passed down from her own grandmother's encounters with plains tribes, assembled items that could serve as ceremonial elements: eagle feathers that had been preserved from Jeremiah's grandfather's collection, white clay that could be used for traditional face painting, and strips of leather that could be fashioned into authentic-looking ceremonial bands. But the most important element came from Ayanna herself. With trembling fingers, she retrieved her mother's silver bracelet from its hiding place and slipped it onto her wrist where it caught the lamplight with ancient authority. The intricate patterns etched into the metal seemed to pulse with their own life, connecting her to generations of Comanche women who had faced impossible choices with courage and dignity. "Tell me about the bracelet," Jeremiah said softly as Mrs. Vasquez helped Ayanna prepare for the encounter. They had moved to the ranch house's main bedroom, where privacy allowed for the kind of intimate conversation that the coming confrontation might make impossible. "It belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, and now me," Ayanna explained, holding up her wrist so the silver caught the light. "Each pattern tells a story. This spiral represents the cycle of seasons. This line of triangles shows the path of the buffalo. These interlocking circles symbolize the connection between all living things." Jeremiah studied the intricate metalwork with respectful attention. "It's beautiful and powerful. Joseph will recognize its significance immediately." "That's what I'm counting on," Ayanna admitted. "Whatever else he's become, he was raised with the same traditions that created this bracelet. Maybe seeing it will remind him that we're part of something larger than this conflict." Mrs. Vasquez finished applying the white clay marks to Ayanna's cheekbones, traditional patterns that identified her as a woman seeking to speak truth in a formal setting. The transformation was startling. Where moments before had stood a refined Eastern lady in frontier dress, there now sat a Comanche woman prepared to face the judgment of her people. "You look like your mother must have," Jeremiah said quietly. "Proud, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who might underestimate your strength." The compliment sent warmth through Ayanna's chest, but it was tinged with the cold reality of what lay ahead. In less than an hour, she would walk out into the darkness to face a man who had dedicated his life to destroying people like her. Success would mean finding a path to peace that preserved everyone she had come to care about. Failure would mean death, not just for her, but potentially for everyone at the Morrison Ranch. A soft knock at the door announced Miguel Santos, who entered with obvious reluctance to interrupt their preparations. "Senorita, there is something you should know before you face Crow Feather," one of the men who rode with him. "I recognized him from the old days." "Who?" Ayanna asked, though something in Miguel's expression suggested the answer would not be. "Welcome, Roberto Sandoval. He was with the Army Scouts for many years, working both sides of the Indian troubles. If Crow Feather has someone like that advising him, then he knows exactly how to exploit any weakness in our defenses." Daniel finished grimly from the doorway. Sandoval was cashiered from the Scouts for selling information to raiding parties. If he's involved, this whole encounter could be an elaborate trap. The revelation cast Ayanna's planned confrontation in an entirely different light. Instead of a traditional challenge governed by cultural protocols, she might be walking into a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate the ranch's defenders through deception rather than direct assault. All the more reason to approach this carefully, Jeremiah said. "Ayanna, if you sense anything wrong, anything at all, you retreat immediately. Honor and tradition are meaningless if you're dead." "Understood," she agreed, though privately she wondered if retreat would even be possible once she committed to the meeting. Men like Joseph Crow Feather didn't offer second chances to people they considered traitors. The moon was rising toward its zenith when Ayanna finally emerged from the ranch house, transformed from Eastern lady to Comanche warrior diplomat. The traditional elements of her appearance, the ceremonial markings, the silver bracelet, the kavas, eagle feather woven into her dark hair created a visual statement that spoke to cultural pride rather than attempted deception. Jeremiah walked beside her to the edge of the ranch compound, his hand resting lightly on the grip of his holstered pistol. The gesture was unconscious, a reflection of his deep reluctance to let her face this danger alone, but it also represented the kind of protective instinct that could destroy her chances of success if Joseph interpreted it as a sign of white interference in Comanche affairs. "Remember," she said softly as they paused at the boundary of torchlight, "whatever happens out there, don't interfere unless it's absolutely clear that I'm in mortal danger. This has to be between Joseph and me, or it won't work." "And if it doesn't work?" Ayanna turned to face him fully, memorizing his features in case this was the last time she would see them clearly. "Then at least we'll have tried to solve this honorably. Sometimes that's all we can do." The kiss they shared was brief but intense, carrying all the words they hadn't had time to speak and all the promises they might never have the chance to keep. When they separated, Ayanna saw her own fears and hopes reflected in Jeremiah's dark eyes, along with something else, a kind of fierce pride in her courage that gave her strength for what lay ahead, the walk across the open ground between the ranch and Joseph's position felt like crossing between two different worlds. With each step away from the circle of friendly torchlight, Ayanna left behind the safety of her assumed identity and moved closer to a confrontation with the heritage she had spent her adult life denying. The silver bracelet seemed to grow warmer against her skin, as if responding to her proximity to someone who would understand its true significance. Joseph Crow Feather waited exactly where she had expected, seated on his horse with the kind of patient stillness that spoke of absolute confidence in his position. In the moonlight, she could see that he was older than she remembered from her childhood, his face marked by years of conflict and loss, but his bearing still carried the unmistakable authority of a war leader who had never known defeat. "So," he said in Comanche as she approached within speaking distance, "the daughter of Tessa Many Horses finally shows her true face. I wondered if years of living among the White Eyes had completely destroyed your courage." The use of her mother's Comanche name hit Ayanna like a physical blow. She had almost forgotten that Tessa had once been known by a different identity, before love and circumstance had transformed her into the woman who had raised her daughter to navigate between cultures. "I honor the memory of Tessa Many Horses," Ayanna replied in the same language, her pronunciation rusty but serviceable. "And I honor the traditions that taught her daughter the difference between courage and foolishness." Joseph's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing that this conversation would be more complex than he had anticipated. "You still speak our language still. That is unexpected. Most who choose the white path forget the words of their people as quickly as they forget their obligations." "I have forgotten neither," Ayanna said firmly, raising her wrist so the moonlight caught the silver bracelet. "I carry the symbols of our people with me always, even when circumstances require me to honor them quietly." The sight of the traditional metalwork seemed to affect Joseph more than her words had. His rigid posture softened slightly, and for a moment she glimpsed the man he might have been in a different world, a leader shaped by wisdom rather than consumed by revenge. "That bracelet belonged to Evening Star, your grandmother," he said quietly. "I remember when she wore it at the treaty meetings, when we still believed the white government might honor its promises. She died believing that peace was possible." Ayanna replied, "My mother died believing the same thing. I stand here tonight because I share that belief, even in the face of evidence that might suggest otherwise." Joseph's laugh was bitter, but not entirely without warmth. "Peace? You sound like the missionaries who came to teach us that turning the other cheek would somehow protect us from bullets and disease. Where did that faith lead your mother, daughter of Evening Star?" Where did it lead our people? It led my mother to love, to family, to a daughter who stands here tonight, still believing that our heritage means more than hatred. Ayanna answered. It led our people to survival, even when survival required adapting to circumstances beyond our control. The philosophical challenge hung in the night air between them, carrying implications that extended far beyond their personal confrontation. This was the fundamental question that had divided Native communities throughout the frontier period, whether resistance through violence or adaptation through compromise offered the better path to cultural survival. Survival through betrayal is not survival at all, Joseph said finally. It is a kind of death that leaves the body breathing while killing the soul. And survival through endless war is not survival either, Ayanna countered. It is a kind of madness that destroys everything we claim to be protecting. For several heartbeats, the only sounds were the distant voices of night birds and the soft stamping of horses. Then Joseph dismounted, his movements deliberate and ceremonial, and Ayanna realized that the true confrontation was only beginning. Joseph Crow. Feather's dismount transformed their encounter from a distant confrontation into something far more intimate and dangerous. Standing on the same ground, separated by only a few yards of moonlit prairie grass, Ayanna could see the full weight of years and loss etched into his weathered features. This was not the noble savage of frontier romance or the mindless killer of newspaper accounts, but a man whose every scar told a story of dreams destroyed and promises broken. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said quietly, switching to English as if acknowledging that their conversation had moved beyond simple cultural challenge. Evening Star could see truth in people's hearts, even when they tried to hide it from themselves. Can you see the truth in mine, daughter of her blood? The question carried layers of meaning that made Ayanna's breath catch. Joseph wasn't simply asking her to understand his motivations, he was inviting her to judge whether the path he had chosen served any purpose beyond satisfying his own rage. It was the kind of vulnerability that could be either an opening for peace or a trap designed to lower her guard. I see a man who has lost everything he valued, she replied carefully, and who has chosen to let that loss define what he has become. But I also see someone who still remembers my grandmother's name, which suggests that not everything good in him has been destroyed by hatred. Joseph's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Careful, Evening Star's granddaughter. Sympathy can be a dangerous weakness when dealing with men like me. And bitter cynicism can be a dangerous weakness when dealing with women like me, she countered, allowing steel to enter her voice. I didn't come out here to offer you pity, Joseph Crowfeather. I came to offer you a choice. Behind them, she could sense rather than see the tension radiating from the ranch buildings. Jeremiah would be watching through field glasses, every muscle coiled for action if the confrontation turned violent. Daniel and his soldiers would have rifles trained on Joseph's position, ready to intervene despite her explicit instructions. The awareness of all those watching eyes added pressure to every word she spoke, knowing that mistakes here could trigger a bloodbath that would consume everyone she had come to care about. A choice, Joseph repeated, as if tasting the word for hidden meaning. What choice could you possibly offer that I haven't already considered and rejected? The choice to be remembered as something other than a killer of innocence, Ayanna said bluntly. The choice to use your remaining years to build something lasting instead of simply destroying what others have built. Joseph's expression darkened. You sound like the peace commissioners who came to the reservation, full of fine words about cooperation and mutual benefit. Where are those commissioners now, Evening Star's granddaughter? Where are the promises they made to our people? Some of them are dead, killed by their own kind for trying to honor those promises, Ayanna replied, drawing on stories her mother had told during their wandering years. Others are fighting in Washington, trying to create policies that might actually protect what remains of our people. And some of them learned, as I learned, that sometimes the most effective way to serve your people is to work within the systems that oppress them rather than simply raging against them. The philosophical challenge struck home in ways that purely emotional appeals had not. Joseph's posture shifted, and Ayanna recognized the stance of a man forced to confront uncomfortable questions about his own choices. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the delicate balance of their conversation. Roberto Sandoval materialized from the darkness like an evil spirit, his horse moving with the practiced silence of a man who had spent years learning to kill from ambush. The former Army scout's presence changed everything about the encounter, bringing an element of calculated malice that had been absent from Joseph's more straightforward challenge. "Enough talk," Sandoval said in accented English, his hand resting meaningfully on his rifle. "The woman has heard our terms. Kill the rancher, abandon the land, and she might live to see another sunrise. Refuse, and we burn everything." Ayanna felt ice form in her stomach as she realized that Joseph's willingness to engage in traditional challenge protocols had been undermined by his advisor's more pragmatic approach to the problem. Sandoval represented everything ugly about the frontier. Conflicts, a man who had profited from violence on all sides, and who saw cultural identity as just another weapon to be exploited. "This is not your fight, Roberto," Joseph said sharply. But there was an undertone of uncertainty that suggested the dynamics between them were more complex than simple leadership. "Isn't it?" Sandoval replied with mock surprise. "I've invested considerable time and effort in building your reputation as a scourge of mixed-blood traders. That reputation is valuable, Joseph. It opens doors, creates opportunities, generates the kind of fear that makes our work easier." The casual admission that Joseph's campaign of terror had been orchestrated for profit rather than principle hit Ayanna like a physical blow. The man she had been trying to reach with appeals to honor and tradition was revealed to be, at least partially, the puppet of someone who cared nothing for Comanche culture beyond its usefulness as a tool for intimidation. "You're using him," she said to Sandoval, her voice carrying a mixture of disgust and dawning understanding. "You're using his pain and anger to build your own power, and when he's served your purposes, you'll discard him like you've discarded everyone else." Sandoval's grin was wolfish. "The girl is smarter than she looks. Yes, I use Joseph's reputation. And yes, I profit from the fear his name generates. But don't mistake me for some heartless manipulator, Senorita. Joseph chose this path long before I offered to help him walk it more efficiently. Chose it, or was pushed onto it by men like you who saw opportunity in his grief." Ayanna challenged. The question struck deeper than she had intended. Joseph's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally a kind of terrible recognition. For the first time since the confrontation began, she saw cracks in the armor of righteousness that had sustained his campaign of vengeance. "Enough philosophy," Sandoval snapped, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "You have 1 minute to give us your answer, Senorita. Submit to our justice, or watch everyone you care about burn." But Joseph raised a hand, stopping his advisor's ultimatum. "No, Roberto. Let her speak. I want to hear what the Evening Star's granddaughter believes is worth more than the blood of our people." The opening was small but significant. Joseph was reasserting control over the encounter, pushing back against Sandoval's attempts to reduce it to simple extortion. Ayanna seized the moment, knowing it might be her only chance to reach the man beneath the legend. "I believe in the vision my grandmother carried to those treaty meetings," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "I believe that our people's greatest strength has always been our ability to adapt without losing what makes us who we are. The buffalo are gone, Joseph. The old hunting grounds are cut by railroads and fences. We can rage against those changes until we die, or we can find new ways to honor the spirits of our ancestors." "And what would those new ways look like?" Joseph asked, genuine curiosity replacing some of the hostility in his tone. "They would look like Jeremiah Morrison building a ranch that respects the land instead of simply exploiting it," Ayanna replied. They would look like mixed-blood families raising children who know both worlds and can navigate between them safely. They would look like people like us proving that heritage and progress don't have to be enemies. Sandoval's laugh was as harsh as breaking glass. Pretty words, but the white world will never accept you as equals. They'll use you when it's convenient and discard you when it's not. At least my way, we take what we can and make them pay for every inch of ground they steal. Your way leads nowhere but more graves, Ayanna shot back. How many innocent people have died to feed your profit margins, Roberto? How many children have lost parents? How many families have been destroyed? All so you could maintain the reputation that keeps you in business? The accusation clearly struck home. Sandoval's casual mask slipped for a moment, revealing something uglier beneath. A man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of principle in favor of simple greed. But it also revealed how precarious his position really was. Without Joseph's mystique as a warrior defending Comanche honor, Sandoval was just another frontier criminal. Joseph, Ayanna continued, pressing her advantage, you've seen what Roberto's way leads to. The Henderson family, were they your enemies, or just convenient targets that served his purposes? How many more innocents will die before you admit that this path serves nothing but his bank account? The silence that followed was filled with tension, so thick it seemed to have physical weight. Joseph's internal struggle was visible in every line of his body as he wrestled with questions that clearly had been haunting him for some time. Sandoval, recognizing the danger to his carefully constructed influence, moved his hand closer to his weapon. Enough! Sandoval barked. Joseph, if you're too weak to do what's necessary, I'll handle this myself. The former scout's rifle was halfway to his shoulder when Joseph's voice cut through the night air like a blade. Put it down, Roberto. What? I said put it down. This is still my fight, and I'll decide how it ends. The confrontation between the two men created a moment of deadly uncertainty. Sandoval's eyes darted between Joseph and Ayanna, calculating odds and assessing threats. Whatever he saw in Joseph's expression convinced him that direct disobedience would be suicidal, but his reluctant compliance carried the promise of future conflict. You're making a mistake, my friend, Sandoval said as he lowered his rifle. The woman is poison. She'll fill your head with dreams of peace while the White Army prepares to hunt us down like animals. Perhaps, Joseph replied quietly. But that's my choice to make. The shift in power dynamics created an opening that Ayanna knew she had to exploit carefully. Joseph had reasserted control over the situation, but his alliance with Sandoval was clearly fracturing under the weight of competing agendas. If she could widen that crack, there might be a path to resolution that didn't require bloodshed. There's something else you should know, Joseph, she said quietly. The man who's been offering you protection at the ranch, Jeremiah Morrison, he's not just another white rancher trying to profit from stolen land. His grandmother was Apache, captured and sold to Comancheros before his grandfather bought her freedom and married her. Joseph's eyebrows rose in surprise. The rancher is mixed blood? Like us, Ayanna confirmed. Like everyone who's trying to build a life that honors both sides of their heritage. He understands the same struggles you've faced, the same choices that have shaped your life. The difference is that he's chosen to build rather than destroy. And where has that choice led him? Sandoval interjected venomously. To a ranch that exists at the sufferance of white neighbors who would turn on him the moment it became convenient. To a life spent hiding his true nature and pretending to be something he's not. A life spent proving that people like us can succeed without abandoning everything that makes us who we are, Ayanna countered. To a community that respects him for his character rather than judging him for his bloodline. To the possibility that our children might inherit a world where they don't have to choose between their heritage and their future. The vision she painted clearly affected Joseph in ways that surprised even her. The hardened war leader's expression softened as he considered possibilities that his years of conflict had forced him to abandon. But Sandoval's growing agitation suggested that this philosophical awakening threatened everything he had worked to build. "Pretty dreams," the former scout said dismissively. "But dreams don't stop bullets or feed families or protect women from men who see mixed blood as an invitation to violence." "No," Ayanna agreed, "but they give us something worth fighting for besides revenge. They give us hope that the cycle of violence can be broken instead of simply perpetuated." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Ayanna and the distant lights of the Morrison Ranch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that made both companions lean forward in anticipation. "I will speak with this mixed-blood rancher," he said slowly. "If he is truly what you claim, if he has found a way to honor both sides of his heritage while building something lasting, then perhaps there are alternatives I have not considered." Sandoval's face went pale with fury. "Joseph, you can't be serious. After everything we've built, everything we've accomplished, you're going to throw it all away for the pretty words of a woman who's betrayed her own people? I'm going to explore possibilities that might serve our people better than endless war," Joseph replied firmly. "If that threatens your business interests, Roberto, perhaps it's time for us to reconsider our partnership." The threat was unmistakable, and Sandoval's hand drifted toward his weapon again. But before the situation could explode into violence, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of new players in this deadly game. Riders were coming from multiple directions, their torches creating a constellation of moving lights in the darkness. "It seems our private conversation is about to become very public," Joseph observed grimly as the riders drew closer. Ayanna could make out the details that identified them: federal marshals from the east, territorial militia from the south, and what appeared to be a delegation of Comanche leaders from the reservation to the west. The convergence of so many different factions at this exact moment and place suggested that word of Joseph's activities had reached far beyond the local community. This was planned, she realized aloud. Someone arranged for all these groups to arrive here tonight. Sandoval's triumphant smile provided the answer. "Did you really think I would allow sentiment to interfere with business? One way or another, this ends tonight. Either Joseph maintains his reputation by dealing with the traitors as promised, or he faces the consequences of disappointing very powerful people who have invested heavily in his success." The trap was closing around all of them, and Ayanna realized that her confrontation with Joseph had been manipulated from the beginning to serve Sandoval's agenda. Whether it ended in violence or reconciliation, the former scout had arranged for witnesses who would ensure the outcome served his purposes. But as the various factions converged on their position, Joseph Crowfeather's expression shifted to something she had not seen before, not the rage of a warrior or the calculation of a strategist, but the quiet determination of a man who had finally decided to stop being used by others and start making his own choices about how his story would end. The convergence of multiple factions transformed the moonlit prairie into a stage where the future of the entire territory would be decided. Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived first, his small contingent of deputies spreading out in professional formation that spoke of years fighting frontier conflicts. Behind him came Captain Thomas Brennan of the Territorial Militia, leading 24 mounted soldiers whose nervous energy suggested they expected immediate combat. But it was the third group that commanded everyone's attention: 5 Comanche leaders from the reservation, led by the imposing figure of Chief Running Bear, whose presence transformed this from a simple law enforcement action into something approaching a formal tribunal. "Joseph Crowfeather," Marshal Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of federal law across the tense silence. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, and armed insurrection against the territorial government." "And you, Marshal," Chief Running Bear added in heavily accented English, "are trespassing on a matter that falls under tribal jurisdiction." "Joseph Crowfeather is Comanche," His actions reflect on our people, and his judgment must be rendered by our council." Sandoval's triumphant expression flickered as he realized that his carefully orchestrated trap had become far more complex than he had anticipated. Instead of simple military action that would eliminate Joseph and anyone who sheltered him, competing jurisdictions now created legal complications that could derail his entire scheme. Ayanna stood at the center of the converging forces, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine not only her own fate, but the future of everyone at the Morrison Ranch. More importantly, she realized that this moment represented a crossroads for the entire question of how mixed heritage people would be treated in the emerging frontier society. "There's a fourth option," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled groups. "One that serves everyone's interests better than the alternatives you're proposing." Marshal Hayes's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Miss, this is a federal matter. I appreciate your concern, but—" "My name is Ayanna Redfield," she interrupted firmly. "Granddaughter of Evening Star, daughter of Tessa Many Horses, and the woman Joseph Crow Feather came here to judge. If anyone is standing to speak at this tribunal, it's me." The announcement sent ripples of reaction through all the assembled groups. Chief Running Bear's expression shifted to one of surprised recognition. Evening Star had been a respected figure in tribal politics before the reservation period, and her granddaughter's presence added legitimacy to any proceeding that claimed traditional authority. "You are Evening Star's blood?" the chief asked in Comanche, his tone carrying new respect. "I am," Ayanna replied in the same language. "And I invoke the right of family to speak for the accused before judgment is rendered." Joseph's eyes widened as he recognized the traditional legal framework she was invoking. Under old Comanche law, family members had the right to present evidence, and arguments before tribal justice was administered. It was an ancient protection designed to ensure that personal conflicts didn't override community interests. "This is ridiculous," Captain Brennan interjected. "We're not here to play games with savage customs. Crow Feather is a wanted criminal, and he's going to hang for his crimes regardless of what his grandmother's cousin has to say about it." The casual dismissal of tribal traditions as savage customs created exactly the kind of inflammatory moment that Ayanna had been hoping to avoid. But it also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the fundamental differences between the various approaches to justice being offered. "Captain Brennan," Chief Running Bear said with dangerous quiet, "you would do well to remember that you are a guest on land that was Comanche long before it was Texas, and may be Comanche again long after. Your territorial government has been forgotten." The implicit threat was unmistakable, and suddenly the assembled groups found themselves facing the possibility of a much larger conflict than anyone had anticipated. Sandoval's expression showed growing alarm as he realized that his simple scheme was spiraling beyond his control. "Perhaps," Marshal Hayes said carefully, "we should allow Miss Redfield to speak her piece before we proceed with any precipitous actions." It was a diplomatic solution that gave everyone time to assess the situation while avoiding immediate confrontation. Ayanna nodded gratefully, knowing that this might be her only chance to present an alternative that could satisfy all the competing interests. "Joseph Crow Feather stands accused of crimes against the territorial government," she began, her voice carrying across the moonlit gathering. "But before we proceed to judgment, we should examine whether those crimes were committed of his own free will, or whether he was manipulated by others who profited from his pain." She turned to face Sandoval directly, noting how the former scout's hand had drifted to his weapon again. "Roberto Sandoval has spent the past 2 years building Joseph's reputation as a scourge of mixed-blood families, not because he cares about Comanche honor, but because that reputation serves his business interests." "That's a serious accusation, miss," Marshal Hayes said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have Joseph's own testimony, if he's willing to give it honestly," Ayanna replied. "Tell them, Joseph." Tell them how Sandoval first approached you, what he promised, and what he's really been using your anger to accomplish." Joseph was silent. For a long moment, his internal struggle visible to everyone present. Finally, he spoke in a voice heavy with reluctant recognition. "Roberto came to me after my wife and children died in the smallpox outbreak at the reservation. He said the disease had been introduced deliberately by white settlers who wanted to clear the land for development. He offered to help me seek justice." "And what form did that justice take?" Chief Running Bear asked gently. "At first, we targeted only those who had actually profited from our people's suffering, corrupt Indian agents, dishonest traders, land speculators who used false documents to steal reservation territory." Joseph's voice grew harder as he continued. "But Roberto always pushed for more violent methods, claiming that mercy was seen as weakness by our enemies." "When did it change from seeking justice to terrorizing innocents?" Ayanna pressed. Joseph's shoulders sagged under the weight of unwelcome memories. "When Roberto started providing intelligence about mixed-blood families. He said they were the greatest threat to our people's survival, because they gave whites an excuse to claim they were accommodating Indian interests, while actually destroying our culture." "And you believed him?" Chief Running Bear asked, his tone carrying disappointment rather than condemnation. "I wanted to believe him," Joseph admitted. "My pain was so great that any explanation for it seemed preferable to accepting that sometimes terrible things happen without reason or purpose." Sandoval's face had gone pale as he realized that Joseph's confession was destroying the carefully constructed narrative that had sustained their partnership. "This is all very touching," he said with forced casualness, "but it doesn't change the fact that Joseph chose his actions. No one forced him to kill those people." "No one forced him," Ayanna agreed, "but someone certainly guided him toward targets that served purposes beyond simple revenge." "Tell us, Roberto, what did you gain from Joseph's reputation? Who paid you to ensure that mixed-blood families remained isolated and vulnerable?" The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Sandoval's composure finally cracked completely, revealing the calculating opportunist beneath the facade of principled advisor. "You don't understand the forces at work here," he snarled. "There are people with significant investments in this territory who need the Indian problem resolved permanently. Half-breeds like you just complicate the process by making it harder to maintain clear racial boundaries." Marshal Hayes stepped forward, his hand moving to his own weapon. "Are you telling us that you've been orchestrating terrorist attacks to serve the interests of land speculators?" "I'm telling you that some problems require creative solutions," Sandoval replied, his mask of civility completely abandoned. Joseph was a useful tool for maintaining the kind of instability that makes territorial acquisition more profitable for the right investors. The admission sent shockwaves through all the assembled groups. Chief Running Bear's expression darkened with rage at the revelation that his people's suffering had been deliberately amplified for economic gain. Captain Brennan looked genuinely stunned by the implications for territorial security. Even Marshal Hayes, accustomed to frontier corruption, seemed shaken by the scope of the conspiracy, but it was Joseph's reaction that commanded everyone's attention. The proud war leader's face went through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally a kind of terrible understanding of how completely he had been used. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confronting the full magnitude of his betrayal. "You made me into a monster to serve your profit margins," he said quietly. "You took my grief for my family and twisted it into a weapon against innocents who shared nothing but bloodline with those who had wronged me." "I gave you purpose," Sandoval shot back desperately. "Without me, you would have drunk yourself to death on the reservation, like so many others." "You gave me an excuse to avoid the hard work of healing," Joseph corrected grimly. "And now good people are dead because I was too weak to face my pain honestly." The confession created a moment of profound silence as everyone present processed the implications of what they had heard. Sandoval's scheme was exposed, Joseph's motivations were revealed, and the fundamental question of justice remained. What should be done with a man who had committed terrible crimes while under the influence of deliberate manipulation? The territorial government demands that Joseph Crowfeather be turned over for trial and execution, Captain Brennan said finally, breaking the tense quiet. And tribal law demands that he face judgment from his own people for crimes that damaged our relationship with neighboring communities, Chief Running Bear added. Both approaches serve the interests of justice, Marshal Hayes observed, but neither addresses the larger question of how to prevent similar manipulations in the future. Ayanna realized that this was her moment to present the alternative she had been developing throughout the long night's confrontation. There's a third path, she said clearly. One that serves justice while also serving the cause of peace. We're listening, Marshal Hayes said. Joseph Crowfeather's crimes were real, and they demand real consequences, Ayanna began. But those consequences should serve the cause of healing rather than simply satisfying the desire for revenge. Let him spend the remainder of his life working to repair the damage he's caused, not hiding on a reservation or hanging from a gallows, but actively building bridges between the communities his actions have divided. Chief Running Bear nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in an approach that honored both justice and rehabilitation. You speak of restitution rather than punishment. That is an old way, when our people practiced before the white courts taught. You wish to value vengeance over healing. And what would this restitution look like in practical terms? Marshal Hayes asked, his lawyer's training evident in the question. Joseph would work under supervision to establish safe passage and fair trading. Relationships between Comanche communities and frontier settlements, Ayanna explained. His knowledge of both cultures, combined with his reputation as a formidable warrior, would give him unique authority to negotiate agreements that protect everyone's interests. And if he betrays that trust? Captain Brennan demanded. Then he faces the full consequences of both territorial and tribal law, Ayanna replied simply. But if he succeeds, he proves that even the deepest wounds can be healed through honest effort and mutual respect. The proposal created another moment of contemplative silence as the various faction leaders weighed its merits against their own political and legal obligations. Finally, it was Joseph himself who broke the quiet. I accept, he said simply. Whatever consequences my actions have earned, I accept. But I would prefer to spend whatever time remains to me trying to build something good rather than simply waiting to die for my crimes. Sandoval's desperate laugh cut through the solemn moment like a blade. How touching. But you're all forgetting something important. I'm not going to prison to protect your precious feelings about justice and redemption. The former scout's hand moved toward his rifle with practiced speed, but he had underestimated the combat experience of the men surrounding him. Chief Running Bear's war club took him in the shoulder while Marshal Hayes's pistol shot shattered his wrist, ending his threat before it could fully develop. As Sandoval writhed on the ground, clutching his wounds and cursing everyone within hearing, the assembled leaders found themselves facing a much simpler problem than the one they had come to resolve. The real architect of the territory's troubles lay before them, his conspiracy exposed and his ability to cause further harm effectively ended. Well, Marshal Hayes observed dryly, that simplifies matters considerably. The administrative details of resolving the crisis took another hour of careful negotiation, but the fundamental framework had been established. Joseph would be held under federal custody, while working under tribal supervision to establish the peaceful relationships Ayanna had proposed. Sandoval would face trial for conspiracy, terrorism, and a host of other charges that would likely keep him in federal prison for the remainder of his natural life. The various government factions would coordinate their efforts to ensure that similar manipulations could not destabilize the territory in the future. But for Ayanna, the most important resolution came when the official business was concluded. and she found herself alone with Jeremiah under the stars that had witnessed the night's dramatic events. The man she had come west to marry took her hands in his, studying her face in the moonlight as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "When you walked out into that darkness tonight," he said quietly, "I thought I was watching you go to your death. Instead, I watched you save us all." "I was saving myself as much as anyone else," she replied honestly. "I've spent my entire life running from who I am, letting fear determine my choices. Tonight I finally stopped running and started fighting for the future I want instead of the one I'm afraid of." "And what future is that?" Jeremiah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "A future where children like us don't have to choose between their heritage and their happiness," Ayanna said. "A future where love is stronger than fear, and where people are judged by their character rather than their bloodline." The kiss they shared was different from their first tentative embrace, deeper, more confident, and carrying the weight of promises made and kept under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. When they separated, Ayanna saw her own hopes and determination reflected in Jeremiah's dark eyes, along with something new, the quiet certainty of a man who had found his partner in every sense of the word. "So," he said with a smile that transformed his weathered features, "does this mean you're finally ready to marry me?" "I've been ready since the moment I saw you waiting at that stage," she replied, surprised by the truth of her own words. "I just needed to become worthy of the man who was brave enough to build a life without hiding from who he really is." 3 months later, Silver Creek hosted the most unusual wedding in its brief history. The ceremony was conducted in both English and Comanche, with Chief Running Bear performing the traditional elements while the local preacher handled the legal requirements. Joseph Crow Feather attended under guard, but with honor, his presence serving as a symbol of the reconciliation that had become possible when people chose healing over hatred. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, the social arbiter who had initially viewed Ayanna with suspicion, had become one of her strongest supporters after learning the full story of the night that had saved their community. The banker's wife now spoke proudly of Silver Creek's role in demonstrating that frontier societies could embrace diversity rather than fear it. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Daniel Morrison, resplendent in his dress uniform, stepped forward to serve as his brother's best man. The estrangement between the brothers had not healed overnight, but Daniel's witness to Jeremiah's courage and integrity had created new respect for choices he had once dismissed as weakness. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly as they stood together before the assembled community. "I thought hiding your heritage was cowardice, but I see now that living honestly with it requires more courage than I've ever possessed." "It's never too late to find that courage," Jeremiah replied gently. "And it's never too late for family to find their way back to each other." As Ayanna spoke her vows in the language her grandmother had carried to treaty meetings, she felt the presence of all the women who had come before her evening star, who had believed peace was possible. Tessa Many Horses, who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter a better life. And now herself, who had learned that the greatest victory was not in hiding from who you are, but in building a world where that identity could be celebrated rather than concealed. The wedding feast that followed drew visitors from 3 different cultures, creating exactly the kind of community that Ayanna and Jeremiah had envisioned when they first spoke of building bridges between worlds. Children played together without regard for the bloodlines that had once seemed so important, while their parents discovered that shared hopes for the future mattered more than different memories of the past. Mrs. Elena Vasquez had outdone herself, preparing foods that honored all traditions represented at the celebration. Tables groaned under the weight of traditional Comanche cornbread, Mexican tamales, and frontier beef roasts, while musicians from each culture took turns performing songs that told stories of love, loss, and redemption. The elderly housekeeper moved through the crowd with tears of joy in her eyes, finally seeing the dream she had carried since her own mixed marriage decades earlier come to fruition in the lives of people she had come to love as family. Joseph Crow Feather sat at a table with federal guards nearby, but his presence served as a powerful symbol of transformation rather than threat. Throughout the evening, various community members approached him, some offering forgiveness, others seeking understanding of how such terrible events had come to pass. His conversations were conducted with dignity and honest acknowledgement of the pain his actions had caused, marking the beginning of a healing process that would take years to complete, but had finally begun in earnest. The most touching moment came when young Tommy Henderson, sole survivor of the family Joseph had destroyed, walked slowly across the dance area to stand before the man who had orphaned him. The crowd fell silent, waiting to see whether this encounter would shatter the fragile peace that had been so carefully constructed. My pa always said that hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, the boy said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space. I don't want to drink that poison for the rest of my life. Joseph's composure finally broke completely. Tears streamed down the weathered warrior's face as he knelt before the child, unable to speak for several long moments. When he finally found his voice, it carried the weight of genuine remorse and determination. Your father was a wise man. Young Henderson, I will spend whatever time remains to me trying to prove worthy of the mercy you offer. The exchange created a watershed moment that rippled through the entire gathering. If a child could find the strength to choose forgiveness over vengeance, perhaps the cycle of retribution that had poisoned frontier relationships for decades could finally be broken. Marshall Hayes, who had initially opposed any alternative to immediate execution, found himself wiping away tears as he witnessed the power of restorative rather than punitive justice. As the evening progressed, practical discussions began to emerge about how the new approach to territorial conflicts would actually function. Chief Running Bear and Captain Brennan discovered they shared similar concerns about protecting their respective communities while maintaining peaceful relationships. Their conversations laid the groundwork for formal agreements that would establish clear protocols for addressing disputes before they escalated into violence. Dr. Samuel Crawford, the territorial physician who had been called to treat Sandoval's wounds, found himself deeply moved by the evening's demonstrations of healing that transcended physical medicine. The silver-haired doctor had spent years patching up victims of frontier violence, and seeing the possibility of preventing such conflicts through understanding rather than force gave him hope for his profession's role in building healthier communities. Dancing that followed dinner provided opportunities for cultural exchange that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Comanche traditional dances alternated with Mexican fandangos and frontier reels, creating a celebration that honored every heritage represented while forging new traditions that belonged uniquely to Silver Creek. Ayana found herself teaching the steps her grandmother had shown her to Mexican children, while learning Irish ballads from the wives of ranch hands who had emigrated from counties far across the Atlantic. But it was the quiet conversations that proved most significant for her. The future of the territory. Business leaders discovered that former enemies possessed valuable knowledge about sustainable land use, water management, and weather patterns that could benefit everyone. Ranchers learned about traditional methods of predicting drought and flood that had sustained indigenous peoples for centuries. Farmers found that indigenous crop rotation techniques could improve their yields while preserving soil quality for future generations. The transformation was not without its challenges. Several families from neighboring settlements had refused to attend the wedding, maintaining that any accommodation with hostiles represented a dangerous weakness that would inevitably lead to further violence. Their absence served as a reminder that changing deeply held prejudices would require generations rather than single dramatic moments, no matter how powerful those moments might be. Pastor William Thornton, the traveling preacher who had performed the legal aspects of the ceremony, found himself grappling with theological questions he had never previously considered. The obvious sincerity of Comanche spiritual practices, combined with their emphasis on community responsibility and environmental stewardship, challenged his assumptions about civilization and savagery. His evening conversations with Chief Running Bear about the nature of divine presence in the natural world would influence his sermons for years to come. The practical implications of the new approach became clear when Miguel Santos announced his intention to establish a trading post that would serve as a neutral meeting ground for all communities in the region. The enterprise would operate under joint oversight from territorial, federal, and tribal authorities, ensuring that commercial relationships developed fairly for all parties involved. The announcement generated immediate interest from merchants, who had long struggled with the uncertainties created by ongoing conflicts. As midnight approached, the celebration gradually evolved into smaller gatherings where deeper connections could be forged. Ayana found herself seated with a group of mixed heritage women from various communities, sharing stories about the strategies they had developed for navigating societies that often seemed determined to reject them. These conversations revealed that her experiences, while uniquely her own, reflected broader patterns that affected hundreds of families throughout the territory. Maria Santos, Miguel's daughter, spoke about growing up with Spanish, Apache, and Irish ancestry, never quite fitting into any single community, but finding strength in the perspectives that multiple heritages provided. Susan Whitfield, whose Cherokee grandmother had married a Scottish trader, described the constant vigilance required to protect her children from discrimination, while helping them take pride in all aspects of their identity. These women had developed informal networks of mutual support that operated beneath the notice of official authorities, creating safety nets that had sustained entire communities through the worst periods of conflict. The revelation that such networks already existed provided hope that the formal peace being negotiated could build upon existing foundations rather than requiring entirely new structures. Ayana realized that her own journey from isolation to acceptance reflected possibilities that were already being lived out by dozens of other families who had quietly refused to let prejudice determine their destinies. Dr. Crawford's wife, Margaret, had been documenting the evening's conversations with a reporter's eye for detail, recognizing that what was happening in Silver Creek could serve as a model for other frontier communities struggling with similar challenges. Her husband's medical practice had shown her the human cost of ongoing conflicts, and she saw in the evening's events the possibility of preventive medicine applied to social disorders rather than physical ailments. The most significant development came when young Timothy Morrison, Daniel's teenage son who had accompanied his father to the wedding, asked permission to spend the summer working at the Morrison Ranch. The boy's request represented a bridge between the military world that had shaped his upbringing and the civilian community his uncle had built. Daniel's visible struggle with the decision, followed by his eventual agreement, symbolized the kind of personal growth that would be necessary for lasting peace. Father Miguel Hernandez, the Catholic priest who served the Mexican families in the region, found himself engaged in fascinating discussions with both the Protestant preacher and the Comanche spiritual leaders about the common elements underlying their different approaches to divine connection. His own background as a mestizo who had risen through church hierarchy despite social barriers gave him a unique perspective on the evening's demonstrations of transcendent possibility. The evening's final surprise came when Mrs. Catherine Whitmore announced her intention to establish a school that would serve children from all communities, teaching multiple languages and cultural traditions alongside standard academic subjects. The banker's wife had been profoundly changed by witnessing Ayana's courage and the community's capacity for growth, leading her to reconsider her own role in either perpetuating or challenging the prejudices that had divided their society. As the celebration finally began to wind down in the early hours of morning, Ayana and Jeremiah found themselves standing together on the porch of their home, watching the last guests depart under a canopy of stars that seemed unusually bright. The sounds of laughter and music faded gradually, replaced by the peaceful night sounds of a community at rest. "Do you think it will last?" Jeremiah asked quietly, his arm tightening around her waist. "This feeling that anything is possible. That we've actually changed something fundamental." "I think we've planted seeds," Ayanna replied thoughtfully. "Whether they grow into the forest we envision depends on how carefully we tend them in the years to come. But tonight proved that the soil is richer than any of us dared to hope." The metaphor was apt, she realized. The frontier had always been about planting things in difficult ground and nurturing them through harsh seasons until they could flourish. The difference was that instead of simply importing Eastern traditions and imposing them on Western landscapes, they were learning to cultivate new varieties that drew strength from multiple roots, while adapting to local conditions. Years later, when their own children asked about the night their parents truly found each other, Ayanna would tell them about the choice between fear and love, between hiding and honesty, between the safety of conformity and the courage of authenticity. She would tell them that love was not just an emotion, but a decision, a choice to see the best in others, even when circumstances made it easier to see the worst. And she would tell them that the most important thing she had learned was that heritage was not a burden to be hidden or a weapon to be wielded, but a gift to be shared with anyone wise enough to appreciate its value. In a world that often seemed determined to divide people by the color of their skin or the accidents of their birth, the greatest rebellion was to insist on the possibility of love that transcended all such boundaries. The mail-order bride who had once been afraid to claim her true name had become a woman who helped write new definitions of what family, community, and belonging could mean on the American frontier. And in the end, that transformation proved to be the most powerful force of all, not the violence that destroyed, but the love that built something better from the ashes of old hatreds and ancient fears, but perhaps the most enduring legacy of Cofton of Estivdigris. That extraordinary night was the understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in service of love despite that fear. Every person who attended the wedding carried that lesson home to their own communities, where it would influence countless future decisions about how to respond when faced with difference, conflict, and the eternal human choice between building bridges or walls. The story of Ayanna Redfield and Jeremiah Morrison became part of Silver Creek's founding mythology, told and retold with the kind of embellishment that transforms historical events into moral instruction. But at its heart, the story remained true to the essential truth that had emerged from their extraordinary courtship, that the most profound victories are won not through conquest but through the patient work of building understanding across the divisions that seem to separate us from one another. In a territory where survival had often seemed to require choosing sides, they had proven that the strongest position was in the space between worlds, where love could flourish precisely because it refused to be constrained by the boundaries others insisted were absolute. The months that followed the wedding brought practical challenges that tested the community's commitment to their newfound ideals. When drought threatened the region's crops, traditional Comanche knowledge of underground water sources proved invaluable in locating new wells that sustained both ranches and settlements. Joseph's supervised work with various communities gradually transformed him from feared outlaw to respected mediator, though the process required constant vigilance from both tribal and territorial authorities. The trading post that Miguel Santos established became a focal point for cultural exchange that extended far beyond simple commerce. Cherokee families traveling the area shared advanced techniques for preserving food through harsh winters, while Mexican artisans taught leatherworking, methods that improved both durability and beauty of frontier goods. These exchanges created economic bonds that made future conflicts less likely, as communities discovered they prospered more through cooperation than competition. Ayanna's role evolved into something resembling a cultural ambassador, helping newly Arrived families understand the complex social dynamics that had developed in Silver Creek. Her ability to communicate in multiple languages, combined with her hard-won understanding of the challenges faced by mixed-heritage individuals, made her uniquely qualified to help others navigate the delicate process of integration without abandoning their authentic identities. The school that Mrs. Whitmore established attracted attention from territorial education officials, who initially viewed multilingual instruction with suspicion. However, the obvious academic success of children who learned to think across cultural boundaries gradually convinced skeptics that diversity represented strength rather than confusion. Within 3 years, similar schools had been established in 5 other frontier communities, each adapted to local cultural combinations while following the Silver Creek model. Dr. Crawford's medical practice expanded to include traditional healing methods he learned from Comanche practitioners, creating a more comprehensive approach to frontier healthcare. His documentation of these techniques provided valuable medical knowledge while demonstrating that scientific advancement could incorporate indigenous wisdom rather than dismissing it as primitive superstition. The collaborative medical practices that emerged served as another powerful example of how different knowledge systems could strengthen rather than threaten each other. The success of Silver Creek's experiment in inclusive community building attracted visitors from across the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters, government officials, religious leaders, and social reformers came to observe how former enemies had learned to live together peacefully. These visits created opportunities to spread the model while also bringing external scrutiny that required constant demonstration of the community's genuine commitment to their principles. As seasons turned to years, the children who had played together at Ayanna and Jeremir's wedding grew into young adults whose worldview had been shaped by the possibility of harmony across cultural lines. Their casual multilingualism, their easy friendships across ethnic boundaries, and their sophisticated understanding of different value systems represented a new generation that saw diversity as natural rather than threatening. These young people would carry the Silver Creek model to universities, government positions, and communities throughout the expanding nation, multiplying the influence of what had begun as one woman's refusal to hide her true identity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.